Later that afternoon, Thomas was puffing back to Tidmouth after dropping Annie and Clarabelle off at the works to be repainted. Thomas was tired, but glad to finally have the rest of the day off, and was heading home. Although he was curious as to who would be taking over his branch line duties while he was resting.
The next morning, Sir Topham Hatt arrived at Brendam Docks to meet the new engine. Suddenly there was a loud sound of pistons pumping. From behind a cloud of steam, a new tank engine puffed slowly out. He was shinier and bigger and stronger than Thomas. "This is Stanley," boomed Sir Topham Hatt. "Welcome to Sodor, Stanley." "Oh, my," gasped Henry. "Whatever will Thomas say?" Later, Thomas stopped at a junction. Suddenly, with a whoosh and a whistle, Stanley raced onto the main line with Annie and Clarabelle. They were having a wonderful time. They clattered straight past Thomas. Thomas watched Stanley disappear. He didn't think it was fun at all.
Thomas was furious. How could Sir Topham Hatt let Stanley pull my coaches on my branch line? Thomas puffed to himself. Thomas was so cross, he failed to notice the broken track ahead. He bumped over the cracked rails and slipped down the side of the hill. "Help!" Thomas cried. He bouldered down the hill. Dirt and rocks bumped and scratched against him, bending his front all up and out of shape. At last, he came to a stop. I wish I hadn't been so jealous of Stanley.
I didn't like him doing my jobs, and now look where I am. I'm a very silly engine," he puffed sadly.
Later, Stanley was told he had to go help Thomas back onto the rails. Stanley was worried about Thomas. He knew how upset he had made him, but none of that mattered now. The only thing that matters now is helping a fellow engine, Stanley wished. Stanley then found Thomas derailed and in terrible shape. "What happened?" Stanley asked Thomas in complete shock. Thomas then told Stanley about the broken track above.
"Stanley," tooted Thomas, "I'm sorry that I was horrible to you. I was wrong, and I was silly to be cross that you were in charge. I want to be your friend." Stanley smiled. "Thomas," he wished, "we will be friends, and I'll have you back on that track in no time." Soon, Stanley was hooked up to Thomas. Then Stanley huffed and puffed. Thomas was very heavy. Stanley didn't give up. "I can do it," he wished, and with a mighty heave, Stanley pulled his friend back onto the track. "Hooray!" tooted Thomas. Stanley smiled. Thomas was his new friend. There was nothing Thomas wouldn't do for Stanley.